Well, hello. This is Wade Frazier. This is February 18th, 2026, 10:39 a.m. This post will finish the series of posts I did on my lessons learned during my days with Dennis. So this is the third and last video on this subject. The next lesson that I learned was that the global power structure has several levels. And they're not all aligned. It's not a big monolith. And the lower levels actually only have a dim awareness, if any, of the higher levels. And Dennis Lee's adventures traverse all levels of power on Earth, from mobsters on street corners to local oligarchs to law enforcement at local, state, and national levels, to boardrooms and penthouse suites, to retail elites, to the White House, to spooks, to the global elites. Dennis saw it all. And I was along for a good part of that ride, especially the darkest chapters. Yeah, it's not one big club, and it's far from united. I mean, basically, it's all a bunch of predators. And so, yeah, the global leader just the apex predator in a political economic jungle full of them. And so, this is something that you learn this if you survive the experiences long enough. These are some of the lessons you learn. This is one of them. At the top, at the global elite level, which again, it's not Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Donald Trump, but at the people who really are at the top of the world power structure. I've heard them called black hats and white hats. The white hats are more like dissident factions. Um, and the black hats certainly directed some of what we encountered. And again, we encounter the white and black hats, but the black hats were certainly involved. Again, the CIA man who offered Dennis $1 billion to go away back in 1988, he was an errand boy for what he called European interests, and that came from global elites, which is something that again, so much of this I didn't learn until later. I didn't even hear about that offer Dennis got until 1996. Yeah, and so again, these are lessons that I learned over the years. Some of it I fully learned by the time I was done in 1990, but others took more years, more events, more study, more information from people such as Dennis. Um, yeah, so the so-called black hats, the global elites certainly directed a lot of what we encountered. But for instance, when those sheriff's deputies stole our technical materials in the raid, they had no idea who they were stealing it for, and I'm sure they didn't even care. They were just being they were handsomely compensated, and that was all that mattered. Just hitmen. Yes, hitmen usually don't know too much. Quite often, they don't know too much about their what's going on. They just know that they're supposed to take out a target and get paid well. And that's all that matters. Um, and then when like Mr. Investigator was assigned to the case, when Mr. Deputy um, was off of it, really. He was so corrupt. He didn't care if his targets were innocent or not, and he'd lie as much as he needed to convict them, because convictions was all his performance was measured on. So, yeah, he was so corrupt. His incentives were so perverse. He didn't need to be told what to do. Yeah, he didn't need to be in on it. He was just, here's a target for you to take out. And he's like, yes, boss, and yeah, so he had no awareness of the global elites being behind any of that. He was just doing a job, doing a dirty job. Somebody had to do it. That's what he did. All presidents since John Kennedy were puppets and knew it. And I've written on this at great length. They had an awareness that they were nowhere near the top. So, yeah, I don't think any president since John Kennedy was deluded enough to think that he was anywhere near the top of the global power structure. And I doubt they have much understanding or awareness of the levels above them. They just, again, this is kind of where some of the Stephen Greer stuff comes in, where presidents are totally out of the loop on issues, UFOs, again, ETs. They don't even know where the loop is, so they're totally in the dark. And so this is something that comes out. It's come out a lot. Greer's not the only guy. Um, And like such a sitting president didn't really follow orders so much as the sitting presidents couldn't even make decisions the important decisions. They were totally out of their purview. They had no information to even base any decisions on. So the existential issues that we face, politicians are totally worthless because they have no idea. They have no idea what's going on, really. No idea was, yeah, they're all, and politicians aren't heroes. And so the thing where, yeah, so the existential issues we face, those sitting American presidents useless. Can be no help at all. And all the lower levels of the power structure, again, they usually have a dim understanding of what happens above them. And again, that's not surprising, that they're not going to. And they may receive direction and incentive at times, but that's probably a subtle process. And they act independently, as that's something that back they're not all aligned. So they act independently quite a bit without any guidance, which I'll get into a little more of that later in this post. My next lesson learned was the retail elite are not at the top. And again, American presidents, billionaires like Elon Musk and Bill Gates, the people who make the Times list of 100 most influential people on Earth every year, those people, none of them are anywhere near the top of the global power structure. And people won't encounter the higher levels of the power structure unless they do something, like what we did, which the top of the power structure sees as a threat. And even then, all that we encounter were their minions and dissident factions, and so it's a thing where, as I said in my interview last summer, those Green Party guys, I can't say for sure what Musk and Gates know, but if they don't understand they're nowhere near the top, then they're really naive. And my guess is they know their place. That's my guess. They know how lowly they really are in the scheme of things on Earth. I'm not going to say they're following orders, but definitely there's a lot that they don't. Yeah. So I think that they're probably aware of the higher levels, and they've probably been given some instruction, be my guess, and warned against certain areas. It's like you're not going to go there. And we saw this. Billionaires would get their lives threatened, kill the whole families if they got involved in these areas. So I'd imagine that these guys have had enough encounters to realize that they're nowhere near the top. The next topic, next lesson I learned was that organized suppression is at least 90% structural. And as I stated at the beginning of these posts, most of these lessons are just variations of my first one, which is personal integrity is the world's scarcest commodity. And in fact, this issue is related to the one I just discussed, where there's various levels of the power structure. So nobody had to tell the electric companies in Washington State to wipe out Dennis's company. They recognized the threat that this heat pump presented. Again, putting it on people's homes for free. So they acted accordingly, and corrupt officials were at their bidding. They lined up. So the corrupt officials would line up to do their bidding. But the Attorney General's hatchet lady, Betsy, she knew she was engaged in criminal behavior, and she eventually quit her job. So when her nose was rubbed in her crimes enough, she actually quit her job. And she was the only official whose conscience ever got to her that I ever saw. And again, I said, well, she was the best of them, but she got disbarred several years ago for looting over $100,000 from her client's bank account. And she was the best of them. Yeah, none of the rest of them even evidence a flicker of conscience. They're just, just hitmen and hit women, taking out targets and getting paid well. And that's all that mattered. Years later, when I encountered Ed Herman's propaganda model, I saw the same dynamics. So the propaganda model is essentially a conflict of interest model, which is the press's stated purpose of pursuing the truth and holding power accountable. Well, propaganda model shows why that's not what happens. And it's basically a conflict of interest model. So the ideal of pursuing the truth and holding power accountable, there's too many conflicts of interest in a capitalist-owned press to achieve something like that. So the pursuit of the truth is not a priority in the media, more about brainwashing the public. Just like the pursuit of justice is really not a priority in our legal system. And the conflicts of interest are just too great, and the incentives are too perverse for people in those fields to really escape the system's clutches. And as Noam Chomsky has stated, people who might pursue the truth and justice, etc., they're weeded out of the systems early on. Yeah, so the best and the brightest aren't going to be found there in those structures. So, my lesson was that most of the damage done by organized suppression is really mostly the result of people just doing their jobs in corrupt systems. And so again, it's structural. It's just people doing their jobs with perverse incentives. That's mostly what it is. And so, yeah, organized suppression. So the conspiracist aspect of it, it exists. And this is where I've always talked about 1% conspiracy, and 99% complicity. Yeah, in this how to say it, in this point, I'm saying at least 90%, but it's 99. It's some number like that. It's over 90 of complicity. And I'm saying it's like 99% complicity. Yeah, that was that lesson. And again, it was just years of bearing the brunt of organized suppression, and years of study, etc., made that clear to me. And I said, when I encountered propaganda model years later, I saw, oh, look at this. This is why the media does this. So it's all similar. It's all the same basic dynamic. The next lesson I learned is that people who are operating primarily from self-interest, organized suppression defeats them almost effortlessly. Basically, organized suppression, they are the avatars of self-interest. Yeah, these are dark pathers, and so self-interest, self-servingness is a science to those people. And so if they encounter people that are motivated by self-interest, they're easily defeated, and usually they end up, how to say it, organized suppression doesn't even need to get applied most of the time, because these people who are self-interested are gonna take it down in a flame and a big bloodbath anyway. Like, again, as I mentioned before, orcs lusting after the One Ring. So yeah, the self-interested are easy to defeat by organized suppression. It doesn't take much. Yeah, so those self-interested will wreck the efforts to greed, fear, and other vices. Yeah, so any efforts that are based on self-interest are already on their way to self-destruction, and it only needs a little bit of a nudge from organized suppression to end up in a bloodbath of ruined lives. The next lesson I learned, and this was something that this took long. Again, this is one of these things where I learned a lot of it with my days with Dennis, and it was something that was just lodged in my consciousness, like, this is an issue. And as I've, in fact, digress a little bit, so I mentioned that conspiracist political literature was the first alternative political literature that I ever encountered, and I encountered it in my days with Dennis, in Ventura in particular. And this is something that, and again, I've studied a lot of conspiracist literature. I've studied a lot of other kinds of analysis, let's say. Again, Ed Herman's propaganda models, structural models, and I found that conspiracism means, so a conspiracy theory is a theory on some event that's like there was a conspiracy involved. In fact, Brian O'Leary, he actually wrote about this, where why is conspiracy theory some kind of epithet that always means tinfoil hatters? And this is something that, in fact, this is I've how to say it. It's out there. It's easy to find, where actually the term conspiracy theory was weaponized by the CIA and friends to dismiss anybody who challenged the Warren Commission's conclusion on the John Kennedy assassination. So yeah, so conspiracy theory has been this epithet now in most of my lifetime. And so there's a thing of conspiracy theories, but conspiracism is an approach which basically looks at everything through the lens of conspiracies. And back to, I said, 90% structural organized suppression, the 1% conspiracy, 99% complicity. And so to think that conspiracies explain everything that's going on, all the terrible things that happen, and think it's all one big conspiracy, that's a really simplistic kind of Saturday morning cartoon version of the world. It doesn't work that way. And so again, the vast majority of the damage inflicted on our efforts was either self-inflicted or inflicted by officials and media personnel simply doing their jobs. And lying, cheating, and stealing was normal for them. This is these people. Back to personal integrity is the world's scarcest commodity. So and so the conspiracists, they basically, and I've seen this so much, it's like conspiracists will embrace any conspiracy theory, no matter how wacky, no matter how unsupported. They'll just, and again, it's kind of a tabloid fascination that I've seen, and oh my God, in the last 30 years, it's like some new conspiracy theory makes surrounds, followed by another one, another one, another one, over and over and over again. And it's all the same stuff. And again, it's kind of a tabloid level, paranoid kind of viewpoint, and so it's really, so again, conspiracies are real. My life got ruined by the biggest one in the world, but to look to conspiracies to explain everything, back to the 1% conspiracy, 99% complicity. Conspiracists ignore the 99% complicity, and they focus on the 1% conspiracy. But most of the time, they don't even get that right, because the conspirators hide in the shadows, right? So again, that's a global level of organized suppression of free exotic technologies like free energy and anti-gravity. They're not privy to what's going on. So it's a thing where only people like me and Dennis, Brian, and our few buddies are the ones that have any direct experience with these issues. And it's like, yes, okay, the conspiracies are real. Or Gary Ween, hearing things after the John Kennedy assassination from John Tower that Oswald didn't do it, which has been proven in spades since then. So conspiratorial framework is really a victim's view of the world. Structuralism can be too. So it's a thing where there's a difference between thinking there was a conspiracy and just have this paranoid, viewpoint towards the whole world. And so, and I've eventually, over my studies, I eventually realized it's a tribalism. It's just another tribalism of attributing all of our woes to some evil-doing outgroup, when virtually all the responsibility resides with us. So this is something that, and so conspiracism, I see it as a really stunted mindset. And people who are stuck there will not achieve productive perspectives if they're mired in conspiracism. And I said it's not to deny all conspiracies. That's not the point. It's just that should not be the only lens that people look at the world through, because they tend to get a very tunnel vision, stunted perspective, which again is totally unproductive and leads to paranoia and all sorts of, again, pain. All sorts of pain comes from the conspiracist mindset. The next topic and lesson learned was a scientific illiterate public is easily led astray. And I've discussed this a lot. I was raised to be a scientist, again, but had a paranormal experience when I was 16 that, unbeknownst to me, had ruined me as a mainstream scientist, where my career began. And 5 years after my awakening moment like that, Brian O'Leary had the same experience doing the same exercise 5 years later, which ruined him as a mainstream scientist, because he could no longer drink the Kool-Aid of materialism. Yeah, materialism is a religion. But scientific literacy. So I've seen estimates that maybe only a third of the American public is scientifically literate, but that's pretty low bar. It's kind of like understanding the New York Times, science section or something. But for me, meaningful scientific literacy, I'm going to guess it's about 5% of the population. And those people should be able to state the mechanics of global warming and how electrons capture photons and emit them. But I rarely encounter people who understand those basics. And what I found is it's almost back to the conspiracism issue, is that scientifically literate people latch on to the latest conspiracist gossip and their latest shred, led astray by the latest fad. Yeah, so I don't need to tell people how these fads come and go across the internet. And the scientifically illiterate just go chasing after all of them. Again, they don't have any discernment. And that's the thing about scientific literacy is about discernment. It's the thing where yeah, just because some bright idea comes out, it doesn't. A scientist ideally should not immediately embrace it. It gets subjected to the scientific process, and only when it passes muster with scientific investigation will it move from bright idea to hypothesis to theory to law. So, so I found that scientifically literate generally didn't have that kind of discernment that a scientist ideally uses when looking at new ideas. And I've just seen this so often where some geezer gets on YouTube and says he was an insider of the global elite and he knows how to save the world, and without presenting any evidence or credentials whatsoever, and people just lap it up. And I've seen this over and over again. And I'll give some examples. Like, I am continually so approached by people who think that the Apollo moon landings were faked, never happened. And I did my work. I did my homework on this many years ago, and published my findings in 2001. And there's not a shred of credible evidence that the moon landings were faked. But I get approached this day, even by scientists who think that the moon landings were faked, or they cite this so-called evidence, which isn't evidence really at all. And how to say it? The left is also scientifically illiterate, so it's a thing where, yeah, this again, right, left, center. There's very few scientifically literate people, and so all of their positions that I've seen are full of scientifically illiterate stuff. And yeah, and this is something I've seen over and over. And again, the chaff needs to be, the wheat needs to be winnowed from the chaff. And on the fringes, there's a mountain of chaff for every grain of wheat. And I have sifted through a great deal of it over the years. And I have a healthy skepticism to fringe ideas and new ideas, which people should. But real skepticism means finding out, not what organized skeptics do. And that's part of my next topic, which is scientific and scientistic dogma is a great barrier to comprehension. And so, yes, today mainstream science doesn't have all the answers either. And in fact, in the late 19th century, the leading scientists announced that almost everything that could be discovered had been. And all the scientific process would be doing in the future would just be sort of filling in some small gaps in scientific knowledge. Yeah, this was in the late 19th century. So it was this, again, that's scientism. It's in fact, those same kind of scientists declared that heavier and air flight was impossible. And while the Wright brothers were flying through the air, they were ignored by the media and scientists, even ridiculed for like 5 years after they first flew. And soon before he died, Brian O'Leary told me that today's scientists are even more deluded than those who ignored and dismissed the Wright brothers. And as I've stated often, in a world of scarcity and fear, eventually everything gets corrupted. This is how it is. In a world of scarcity and fear, everything will get corrupted. Those high ideals are never even approached in a world of scarcity and fear. And in fact, examples of millions of people finally awoke to how corrupt biomedical science is during the COVID-19 pandemic. Even the defenders of science call biomedical science the flimsiest and most corrupt branch of science. So, yeah. And yeah, it was wow. And yeah, so really scientific dogma is the enemy of truth. And, in nearly 30 years of my presence on the internet, I have yet to have even one robust discussion of why Dennis's heat pump is the world's best heating system, while I get attacked by skeptics and other scientific posers. And it's garden variety thermodynamics to understand why it's the world's best heating system. And it's been completely wiped out in North America. There's a company in Portugal that still makes them, but that's the only other company I know of in the world that still does it. And I can't have a robust conversation about this very basic issue. It's not hard to understand. And so this is, and again, I've seen this where all of these scientists and engineers can just regurgitate their textbooks, even when they see the data that defies their textbooks. And so this is too common. My friend who was kidnapped and given that underground technology show by a distant faction of the global elite, the stuff he was shown, anti-gravity, free energy, etc., blows orthodox physics out of the water. But try to find a mainstream scientist that you can rationally discuss these issues, and good luck with that. It's not easy. Some do. There's some dissidents out there, but not many. And they risk their careers to be dissidents. This is back to dogma. Yeah, not just the Catholic Church. And so, yeah, dogma is always an enemy to the pursuit of truth, and it applies to today's science as much as anything else in many ways. So and the last topic, or again, last lesson that I had on my list here was the masses can't distinguish the darkness from the light, and even call the darkness the light. And so it's a thing again, back to discernment. And so, I've written at great length on how mass murdering thieves were presented to me as American heroes and saints, founders of our great nation, etc. And yeah, so mass murdering thieves become heroes and saints. And this is the exact topic I'm discussing here. Or Mr. Deputy was promoted and then given an award for the most difficult investigation in department history, even though he was probably the most corrupt official that I ever personally encountered. And even my own mother lauded Mr. Deputy and those gangsters while attacking me. And so, yeah, so the masses, in fact, it's all about self-interest, self-service, etc. So it's a thing of whatever serves their interests is the light. It's about that basic. So that sort of ends those lessons, which again I learned during my days with Dennis, the first stint. And as I stated, some of those were fully learned by the time I left my hometown in 1990. Others took a number of years later to learn when I got more information or when I did some more study, and then it eventually sank in. Yes, some things I'd have an event and then I didn't really fully understand what was happening, if I ever get full understanding, but a much greater understanding, 15, 20 years later. Again, when Mormons stole our company in Seattle and Ventura, it was almost a generation later when I heard Stephen Greer say that the Mormon financial empire was the ringleader of the global elite who suppressed people like us. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, well, that explains that. So, yeah. And so these lessons I learned are not, how to say it, if anybody realistically wants to make a dent, wants to address the existential issues that we face, and they're urgent, incredibly urgent issues. We're on the brink of catastrophe as a species, threatened to go extinct and take the Earth's ecosystems with us, these kinds of things. These are vital lessons to learn. And I learned them the hard way. And the whole point of all the work I do, all my public work, etc., is to help shorten the learning curves of the people that I see. And so I would like to think that of these, 20 lessons that I have listed now over the last few days, that the people I seek, the reality of several of those, they've already learned that. And so if they've learned that, again, personal integrity is the real scarcest commodity. That was number one with a bullet. And when people learn that one, and again, I can't help them learn that. These lessons, I mean, again, they have to learn some of them on their own. And then what can happen is that I went through a lot more than they did, so I can go and there's the other stuff I learned, and so then they can learn those perhaps a little vicariously. Although what I've done in my work is that you can see it's all related, and so none of these, if you understand that first lesson, none of the rest of what I've lit, the other 19 or whatever, they shouldn't be a big surprise. You know, it really shouldn't be that great of a surprise. And so, but again, if somebody wants to make a dent, these lessons are essential because these lessons are the ones that will lead to our success instead of another flame out failure with wreck and shortened lives, which I don't want to see that show again. So anyway, so that's all I have for now.